was to neutralize the workers' movement at the time. And the citizenship issue, again, if you look at 1947, the number of Chinese and Indians who were already born in this country, and the number of people, Chinese and Indians, who actually got citizenship, something like 20% only got citizenship. And this is the politics of the anti-colonial movement, the way in which the British, because the All Malay Council of Joint Action and Putra were calling for self-rule, independence, civil liberties, the inclusion of Singapore. And so what do the British do? They put them on the defensive by saying, you do not have the right to citizenship. So they're forced to defend citizenship. And talking about citizenship, it's interesting that Lim Lian Giok, who in his book I said, the soul of the Malaysian Chinese, had his citizenship revoked in 1961, after independence. You know. And he was the soul of the Malaysian Chinese, fighting for the civil rights of the Chinese, and he was also fighting for the mother tongue rights of the Indians and the Malays in this country. Who was the Tengku to negotiate with him at the Malacca talks. Somebody of that stature could have his citizenship revoked in 1961. So you can see how citizenship, you can see how people banished from this country, the number of people who were banished from this country could be done during that time. And if you compare the demands by the Malay Nationalist Party at the time, very progressive demands, the right to self-determination, civil liberties, improving labor conditions, improving the conditions of the farmers, conditions of workers, etc. And if their People's Constitution, which was the People's Constitution of the All Malay Council of Joint Action and Putra, could have been accepted at independence, for sure there would be no Article 153 as we know it today. And the social contract that UMNO leaders have always wanted us to understand is actually the so-called social contract at the time of independence, after all the compromise, after all the politicking over citizenship, etc. And the way in which the alliance and later the Barisan Nasional came into power must be understood by the way in which the British first saw alliance, because Dato' Orn at the time was the favorite of the British actually. But when he lost out to UMNO, the British decided to back UMNO as the custodian in the new independent Malaya. Another point about the emergency that we have to bear in mind, which was again reneged by the colonial power and the alliance, was the way in which the Tunku had negotiated with Chin Peng and the Communist Party of Malaya at Baling in 1955, in which the insurgents, the guerrillas, were supposed to have an amnesty at independence. But at independence, the alliance reneged on that promise. And only British, when they saw that the alliance were prepared to renege on that promise to the Communist Party of Malaya, were they ready to give independence to the alliance. And that's why the Tunku and the others were very surprised that when they went to London to ask for independence, the British agreed without too much trouble. Whereas in other countries, in Indonesia for example, in this independence, Merdeka had to be fought with blood. I think Dr. Asmi Sharom and Ganesan have already talked about the Reed Commission. I won't go into that. And a point that I made earlier on, because I've already been on quite a few fora with Dr. Asmi and Ganesan. I think we've become the token Malay, Chinese and Indian to speak at forums now. And I've always mentioned this point, that when UMNO talks about the social contract in 1957 is actually changed today. It changed after May 13 with the 1971 amendments with 8A included, with the quota system. It changed again when Abdul Ahmad introduced his his infamous thesis about Ketuanan Melayu, and the way in which the UMNO leaders have been trying to routinize Ketuanan Melayu. The way in which even recently Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, of all people, was trying to rehabilitate this concept of Ketuanan Melayu. He didn't say that Ketuanan Melayu is not Malay domination. He says Ketuanan Melayu is Malay sovereignty. Malay sovereignty means the sovereignty of the sultans. So it's alright, why? Why are you grumbling about Malay Ketuanan Melayu? Ketuanan Melayu is Malay sovereignty. Sovereignty means sultanate. This is somebody who heads the One Malaysia Foundation. Is it called foundation? Chandra Muzaffar is the head of the One Malaysia Foundation, and the foundation is supposed to unite all of us. Things that Ketuanan Melayu is okay, it's about Malay sovereignty. So to conclude, I'm asking, do we go back to the Merdeka Agreement? If we go back to the Merdeka Agreement, it means we remove 1971 amendment. For one thing, the 1971 amendment was enacted during an emergency after May 13. There are a number of things that were enacted during the emergency, you know. One of them is Rukun Negara. There's somebody I know, Gurmeet Singh, for example. He doesn't agree with Rukun Negara. He said because it was enacted during the emergency. But in your exercise book, I think all our young SUARAM activists, in your exercise book in your school, you all have Rukun Negara as if it's part of your. But the Rukun Negara was enacted during an emergency. And I think it should also be renegotiated. 1957 Education Ordinance is quite different from what the Education Act of 1996. In 1957, Chinese schools and Tamil schools were part of the national education system. Today is not. Many lawyers haven't actually, Mr. Yang Bacon has read 1996 Education Act very deeply, and you find that Chinese and Tamil schools don't really have a right in this country. Whereas the 1961 Act just gives Chinese and Tamil schools a right to exist in this country. 1957 Ordinance allowed Chinese secondary schools to exist. Today, they do not have the right to exist. Okay? And the fundamental liberties in the 1957 Constitution were all there. But they have all been superseded by other amendments to the Constitution and by new laws that make nonsense of fundamental liberties. Like mentioned before, the new Peaceful Assembly Bill makes nonsense of the fundamental liberty of the right to peaceful assembly. Constitutional delineation in 1957, it says that the constitutional delineation should ensure that there's no difference of 15% to the national average, which means the difference between the constituency with the biggest number of constituents must not exceed the lowest by more than 15% of the national average. Today, what is the difference? Putrajaya has something like 5,000 voters, and even during my time when I was the MP for Petaling Jaya had 98,000. That's not a difference of 50%, it's a difference of what? On mathematics? Give us a quick, how many percent is that?
20 pounds.
How many percent? 2,000%, somebody said. A difference. So if we can go back to 1957, go back to the social contract. Our UMNO leader says, respect the social contract. Let's respect the social contract, and the minimum of 1957 social contract are these. Are we prepared to go back to these? Can we challenge the political leaders to go back to the social contract of 1957? Why should we go back to the so-called social contract in 1971? 71 is not a social contract, especially after May 13, I call it pogrom, not a riot. So, the NGOs, SUARAM, are drafting a new people's agenda for the 13th general election, in which we hope that these basic Equality Act, affirmative action based on need, sector and class, I'm afraid I don't agree that any community like the Chinese, Indian or Malay, where there is substantial class differentiation, deserves any affirmative action. Affirmative action must be based on sector, such as the plantation workers, such as your fishermen, fishing sector, such as your poor new villages, rural new villages. Class, okay, certain people with below a certain income level should be entitled to affirmative action, and so forth. Need, people, the poor, the elderly, etc. I believe that affirmative action is immoral, as Ganesan has said. It has failed, as Dr. Asmi has said. I believe that many sectors in this country, economic sectors like utilities, coal and gas, etc. in this country, should belong to the people, and they should not be privatized. Well, privatized, especially during the time of Dr. Mahathir, it is time that the people take back what belongs to them. Some utilities that we know that were making lots of money, like telecoms, was the first to be privatized. Why should it be privatized and belong in private hands, who lose money and we have to bail them out? Okay? And I think in this country, we do need to ratify at least the Convention on the Eradication of Racial Discrimination, since we're talking about Article 153. We need to ratify the Convention Against Torture. We need to ratify the Convention, the International Covenant on the Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. These international covenants, you will find, will ensure that the inequality that may arise, the discrimination that may arise, will be put right. Okay, at least our country and our laws, national and state laws, have to abide by these international covenants. So I think this is a good place to stop. Thank you.